All right, American history. Hope you guys are doing well in this teaching of the time of Corona. Today I want to kind of pick up where we left off, talking about Reagan, and this time focusing more on his foreign policy. We started a little bit talking about his foreign policy and his relationship with the Soviet Union prior to Mikhail Gorbachev coming to power in the Soviet Union. So we're going to kind of pick up with that in the kind of the end of the Cold War. And then we'll finish with the Iran-Contra scandal as a kind of foreign policy issue that the Reagan administration had to deal with. So when we focus on Reagan and the Soviet Union, of course, you know, I already mentioned how he referred to him as the evil empire. And, you know, another kind of high point, I guess, in Reagan's trajectory as president was his speech at the Berlin Wall, where he implored Gorbachev to tear down this wall, because again, it was the symbol of the Cold War and how the Soviets could make a big statement in regards to that by tearing the wall down. And these were things that Reagan was really passionate about, and he did want to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons that both sides had. And he also had this belief that we could just really kind of outspend the Soviets, that the Soviets could not keep up with us in our spending if we really were focused on our military spending. And this is one of the reasons why in the 80s our military expenditures did triple during this time period as a means of kind of putting pressure on the Soviets to try to keep up. And it worked out pretty well in regards to causing the Soviet Union to really kind of collapse monetarily and causing them to have reforms and eventually leading to the end of the Cold War. Now, of course, the side effect of that is going to be increased deficits that have continued on to this day. But, you know, we're not going to focus on that economic issue. We're going to focus more on the foreign policy aspect of that. And with that, really kind of the focal point, you know, obviously there was the nuclear weapons, there were the stealth bombers, there were all these new technologies that were developing. But the focal point for Reagan and the Soviet Union in particular is going to be what was known as the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, more popularly known at the time as Star Wars, as Reagan kind of took the popular movie at the time and attached that moniker to it. And the whole idea behind Star Wars, as it kind of related to the Soviet Union, was that if we could put satellites in space and shoot down Soviet missiles as they were launched, that we could protect the United States from any potential nuclear exchange. All right, so the idea is, of course, you know, when we look at how these nuclear missiles work, they have what is referred to as MIRV technology, M-I-R-V, multiple independent reentry vehicles. And so they would have to leave the Earth's atmosphere as they were launched and then re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, and then a number of warheads would scatter to their GPS locations. Well, while they're in outer space, those satellites could shoot lasers and knock them out of the, just blow them up, basically, and they would never have the opportunity to re-enter. And the Soviets really did believe we could do this. They kind of were fearful that the United States' ingenuity and monetary capability, that we could develop this. A lot of Reagan's advisors told him there's no way, this can't happen, we don't have the funds, we don't have the science, this is not something we can do. And in the end, of course, we still don't have this technology. But in the 80s, there was enough kind of questions as to whether this could be done that the Soviets were really pretty fearful of this. And in fact, at the Reykjavik conference, when Reagan and Gorbachev met, and they were very close to reducing the amount of nuclear forces both sides had, one of the caveats by Gorbachev was that the United States abandon Star Wars, that we get rid of SDI, as it will create an unbalanced playing field in their mind. All right, we kind of worked under this assumption of mutual assured destruction, M-A-D, MAD. All right, the idea is we'll never go to nuclear war with one another because we destroy one another. So that's the balance that takes place, and so it's a logical explanation that we don't want one side to gain an advantage because then it tips the scales to one side, and that may mean a nuclear exchange. We try to assure them that, well, we'll never launch first, so you don't have to worry about that. We just need to protect our citizens in case you do. And so that's what Star Wars was all about, and Reagan refused to give it up. He said, you know, no, I'm not going to sacrifice the safety of Americans by giving in on this decision. And so he walks away from Reykjavik without a deal. He was that close to it. And Gorbachev was kind of floored. He really thought he was going to get that done, and it didn't happen. Luckily, a year later, Gorbachev comes back, and agrees basically to reducing nuclear forces, the INF Treaty that we enter into with the Soviets at that point. Begins to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons both sides had, and was seen as a huge first step in that kind of relationship and easing the tensions between us and the Soviet Union that had really kind of increased during the early 80s with some of Reagan's rhetoric and, of course, our military buildup. We begin to see that ebb a little bit there. The Soviets continue then to have some reform movements. Gorbachev was realizing, of course, that the Soviet Union was collapsing economically, that they needed to have some reforms. And so we see glasnost and perestroika as kind of the two policies, an easing relations there a little bit, and an economic reform in the midst of trying to maintain communist control, that they were going to give in a little bit to some of these reforms in the hopes of maintaining communism. But in the end, of course, that's not going to work, as we see eventually then with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 80s. All right, and so a lot of that groundwork was laid during the Reagan administration, but of course his administration will end in January of 1989 when George H.W. Bush takes the oath of office, and then of course in October of 89 we see, of course, the revolutions occurring in Europe and the wall coming down, and so there is a definite kind of connectivity there. So, when we look at Reagan and his Cold War policies, he's given a lot of credit for helping to hasten the fall of the Soviet Union because of those policies. Now, there will be those who will argue that the Soviet Union was going to collapse anyway, that it was inevitable, it's just a matter of when. And so there are those who want to give Reagan a lot of credit, and there are those who, want to kind of give him just a little credit. But, you can read and figure that out for yourself. Now, the last thing foreign policy-wise is this Iran-Contra scandal. This was a scandal that almost, brought down a president, in this age of, we're still, reeling from Watergate. It wasn't that long ago. It was, basically 15 years after Watergate. That you have this scandal in which there seems to be deception from the executive branch, where laws had been violated, and of course that, what was the true story? And so I'm going to try to explain what was going on, because you have two separate situations going on. You have a situation in Iran, and you have a situation in Nicaragua, all right? And so the situation in Iran was that there were hostages. Now, these are separate hostages from the 1980s. This is something, different that occurs later on. And there were some hostages there, and Reagan had a strict no negotiating with the terrorist policy. All right. If we look at how he handled Libya after shooting down, or the explosion, a terrorist attack on a plane, and our strategic strikes against Gaddafi in Libya, there was a strict kind of, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. And so here the government is actually going to sell arms to Iran in exchange for those hostages. All right, so it's kind of a backdoor deal. It's a secret deal. It's not openly known. But of course it's illegal. And so we sell them these weapons. They give us money for them, and the hostages are released. But now we have this money that is dirty money, really. We can't just put it into the government coffers, because people will be like, well, where did it come from? How did we get it? So the administration has to channel it somewhere. And where they decide to channel it is into Nicaragua, where there was this issue where the Contras were trying to prevent communists from getting a foothold in their country. And so we are going to funnel that money to the Contras to buy them weapons and to help facilitate this anti-communist government, which of course was also illegal, as Congress had laid out a law that said we would not aid in this fight in Nicaragua. And so now you have laws broken in two separate situations, in Iran and in Nicaragua. And so when it finally comes to light what was going on, the question was, well, how did this start? Who was involved? Did the president know? What did he know, and when did he know it? And so, Reagan denied ever knowing anything about it, said, he wasn't involved in it in any way. But it seemed like as more and more people talked about it, it seemed like it went higher and higher up the chain. There were some parallels there between what had happened in Watergate and what was happening in Iran-Contra. Now, again, in the end, a number of individuals did come forward and announced that, yeah, I knew I was breaking the law. Oliver North being kind of most popular individual, I guess, because eventually he will go on and win the congressional seat in North Carolina because of what had happened and transpired here. But he basically owned up and said, yeah, we knew this was illegal, but we felt it was the best thing for America, and we did it anyway. Paraphrasing there, of course. And in the end, Reagan did speak to the American public. He took full responsibility. He said he didn't know anything about it. He didn't make any decision, that this went on behind his back. But as president, the buck stops with him, and that he should have known and taken more responsibility. And there was never any evidence that connected him specifically to what had happened, or any kind of denials or anything. Like in Watergate, you had those tapes and other things that kind of showed Nixon's potential involvement in discussion with these individuals. Nothing like that existed with Iran-Contra. But for a president who had become pretty much beloved by the majority of American population, and of course had a lot of positives going through his presidency as far as getting the economy back on track, militarily, a lot of pride in the United States was growing in the 80s. We see, those issues with the Soviets that were starting to come to a head. And yet you had the scandal kind of at the end of his presidency, which kind of taints it a little bit and kind of mars what was really kind of, the last couple of years for the president in regards to some major victories, both economically and foreign policy wise. And so, that's kind of the one big scandal that kind of rocked the Reagan presidency. So those are kind of the two foreign policy issues that you were reading about there in section 2. So now we've kind of gone through Reagan's presidency, and so the next thing we'll be looking at is George H.W. Bush's presidency, which gets off to a tremendous start with his, with the issues in the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism in the Soviet Union, and militarily the issues in regards to the first Gulf War. All of these are going to be huge foreign policy victories for George H.W. Bush, but it's going to be the economic issues that will eventually lead to his downfall. So that'll be the next time we meet. Again, stay healthy, and hope to see you soon.